I'm going to try and summarize the much longer comments of Richard Roberts. And so if someone else could try and keep me on time if I go more than 7 minutes, thanks, because I'll be looking at the text.
Richard, do you want to? Sure.
Thank you very much. Jean-Philippe Platteau's magisterial assessment of the economic history of the continent of Africa tries to explain why there hasn't been a lot of growth between 1960s and 2000. And he focuses on the institutional environment and says that this is related to the cultural patrimony inherited in post-colonial Africa. However, according to Richard Roberts, although Platteau recognizes the history of the African continent and its institutional environment as quite dynamic, he paradoxically uses a static concept of culture. Cultures change, and so do the institutional environments in which people seek to carry out their livelihoods. Another issue he wants to focus on at the beginning is the unreliability of data from Africa. And we have actually very little reliable data about the performance of African economies, and much of the economy is from the informal sector. And although from this I do not suggest that Jean-Philippe does not go into the field, because he actually does, but it is a warning not to use aggregate economic data on Africa without care. And then he goes into several different issues that he wants to highlight. One issue is related to subsistence security and an anti-accumulation ethos. And Roberts argues that given the generally poor quality of tropical soils, the irregularity of rain, and the lack of strong pre-colonial states that were capable of providing famine relief, most cultivators invested their surplus whenever they had any in subsistence security, i.e. investing in networks. Roberts also wanted to highlight the long-term impact of the slave trade on African institutions, which he didn't believe that Jean-Philippe Platteau did sufficiently. And he talked about the transatlantic slave trade exporting some 12 million Africans and the Muslim slave trade exporting some 20 million Africans. And the endemic insecurity of the slave trade era discouraging investment in agriculture improvement or industry. The third issue he wanted to talk about was the invention of tradition. He argues the customary law in Africa was actually the product of an insidious collaboration between African male elders and male colonial officials. Rural despotism emerged because of the ways in which indirect rule empowered African chiefs to define for themselves custom defining access to economic resources. And he goes into a debate between different people about how strong this is. But then he argues the colonial period encouraged the investment in kinship and ethnicity, favored the despotism of chiefs and elderly men, and discouraged alternative forms of economic institutions. Fourth, he wanted to talk about legal dualism and rural despotism and patronage resting on the confluence of ethnicity and customary law, and quotes that modern law is ignored and customs continue to prevail. He says that few scholars of law in Africa would agree with this concept of legal dualism and the underlying dichotomy between customary and modern law. Far from being separate legal spheres, the customary and colonial Western legal systems are part of a single interconnected whole. This issue of the encounter between customary law and the other legal traditions suggests that the sphere of customs was constantly in flux, regardless of colonial policies that sought to fix tradition and support native authority. Fifth, he wanted to deal with the issue of religious conversion. He says Platteau is right to point to the massive resumption of witchcraft accusations in many parts of Africa in the post-colonial period. But he sees less potential for economic change through conversion. quoting from him, "But the exit through conversion was not without its new obligations. Muslims are required to provide the zakat and to make pious gifts. Christians share the wealth through tithing and other forms of charity. Conversion embeds the convert in new communal networks that may have been analogous to kinship ones, but with different forms of social requirements in which gift exchanges remain central obligations. I do agree with Platteau that there are profound differences in the degrees of conversion and the subsequent transformation in behavior." By way of conclusion, I want to reiterate that Africa is a very vast and complex continent with significant variation over time and place. Cultures, religions, and political systems change, and the economic landscape through which individuals traverse also change. What we need to understand is how this wide landscape has shaped by changing cultures and influences outside of the continent, which in turn intersect with an ongoing local process of change within the continent.